give them a heads up.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Life Cycle Institute's presentation of Breaking Down Organizational Barriers, Creating Plant Partnerships. Your speaker today will be Hugh Blackwood. And before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. If you have to submit a question, please use the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have a technical question, send your question directly to the Life Cycle Institute, and you can use the drop-down to choose Life Cycle Institute. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Hugh Blackwood.
Hi there. I too want to thank you for joining us today. I can assure you this will not be a waste of your time, but I want you to do three things today during the webinar. I want you to listen. Number two, I want you to learn. And number three, I want you to lead, because it requires all three of those things for plants to really understand the true value of partnerships, not just on the part of those people that are on the webinar today. Now, for those of you joining us from the East Coast, a word of caution on the phenomenon commonly known as postprandial somnolence. I'll say that one more time for you. Postprandial somnolence. It's a common occurrence directly after lunch, commonly known as food coma. And I won't bother to mention that someone in the room I'm in right now is eating, but it's okay if you're still eating. But my goal today is to make certain that no one suffers from food coma. So hopefully we'll get through this okay. Now, just as a preface, on October 12th, I wrote an article, Impact Newsletter article for LCE, the title of which was Breaking Down Organizational Barriers by Creating Plant Partnerships. I'm not going to read that, obviously, today. We've got a few slides to go through, but if you haven't read it, after the webinar, I encourage you to go back and read it. There's a little more detail and some continuity comments in there that are not in the slides. In that article, I refer to partnerships as compasses. And what they do is they let everybody in the organization know where organizational north is. What direction is organizational north? What we're talking here about is leadership alignment. Paradigm shifts include operations or production, assuming responsibility for reliability. And the third thing is, as listed up above, is accountability, holding each other accountable for agreed upon goals and objectives. And they're focused on business outcomes rather than just departmental metrics. In other words, partnerships prevent stovepipes, or as Michael Hammer calls them, fiefdoms. So today we're going to discuss what they are, why they're important, who needs them, how you implement them, and when to review them. Okay, what we'd like to do is an interactive show of hands, if we can, to see how many of you currently working in a plant have a plant partnership in place. So if you could just look at your show of hands button on the right-hand side, if you just click on that, that'll give you, it should raise the hand so we can get an idea of how many people actually are in plant partnerships. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you just a couple seconds to do that, then get an idea of what the population is, and then we've got some questions later on in the webinar to add some clarity to those of you that are in partnerships at present. So if you would, just find your way to that hand if you're in a partnership and go ahead and click on it. Looking good so far. Looks like the majority of people on right now are in a partnership. I'll give you a couple more seconds. Oh, by the way, we also have the option of typing questions right on the screen. If you use the T box up above that I'm highlighting right now, and you can actually click on that while we're waiting for the response. You can go down to the screen and you can type something. If you want to erase it, click on the eraser, then click on the text, and it should go away. Yeah. Now, if we don't get to all the questions during the webinar itself, then I will make certain that we get an answer back to your question following the seminar. But we've really only got 30 minutes. Okay, I see some more folks are clicking in. That's good. That's good. Okay, I think at this point we're going to go ahead and proceed. But those of you that haven't clicked that want to do so, please do so. Okay, this slide is, I call this the 6-bucket slide, because there are 6 buckets from an end-to-end process, beginning in design and ending in the maintain bucket, that all have a responsibility for reliability. So, you may ask me, why are partnerships necessary in relationship to this 6-bucket slide? It's pretty simple, because in any one of these buckets you see defects that are listed in these red bars in the bottom of each box. And what that indicates is that there are opportunities for defects to enter this process in any one of those 6 buckets. Therefore, if we want to try and minimize the defects, which ultimately lead to unreliable equipment, then it makes sense to have someone involved in that stage of the process that is familiar with reliability. We'll talk about partnership agreements later on within different departments, but suffice to say that more than one department applies to every one of these 6 buckets, and there may be 2 or 3 written partnerships that would make it clear, for instance, to procurement with engineering and also with procurement to maintenance as to parts we want to buy. Do we want to use existing, programmable controllers, for instance, that are in stock, or do we want to buy a newer technology, newer design, which therefore would increase the amount of stores that we have. So lots of different reasons why partnerships are important. And simply stated, what partnerships do in each of these buckets is they do 6 things. They minimize losses, they eliminate waste, reduce downtime, reduce stores, improve quality, and most importantly, address root causes from the very beginning rather than pass them on from one stage to the next. So it's important. This is a pie chart I want to show you that kind of breaks out by percentages 6 different departments in any plant operation, which I refer to as not so typical sources of poor reliability. In other words, well-intended folks without a clear understanding of upstream or downstream needs can lead to departmental sub-optimization. And by sub-optimization, I mean, we don't want plant engineering to come up with really, really great designs and then find that we're installing equipment that either can't be easily operated or maintained. So if you look at this came out of a study a number of years ago, and it was surprising to me how relatively even the 6 different departments are in terms of who has an impact, positive or negative, on equipment reliability. Sales, 15% caused by improper mix or not meeting delivery commitments or wrong size orders. Production, improper planning and poor procedures, poor operating procedures. Maintenance, typically they get blamed for all unreliable sources, but in fact they only have about a 17% piece of the pie. Poor planning, errors in bill of materials, those sorts of things. Procurement, wrong parts, late deliveries, poor selection of vendors. They can't meet their delivery times. Plant engineering, already touched on this, has to do with poor, designs that we're not able to really implement on the plant floor or in the environment in which the equipment was designed. And last but not least, management. Imagine that, management being a source of defects leading to poor reliability. So if you thought maintenance was the sole source of poor reliability, this data would suggest otherwise. The obvious opposite of this is if partnerships exist between all 6 of these departments, then the opportunities for defects to be passed from one stage to the next are minimal or eliminated in many, many cases. Favorite quote of mine from a chap I met years ago, Charlie Bailey, and this really gets at the heart of who owns reliability. And quite simply, he said, reliability cannot be driven by the maintenance organization. It must be driven by the operating units and led from the top. A few years back, Eastman Chemical was faced with an economic downturn, reduced demand for their product, and foreign competition. Sound familiar? Kind of like where we are right now. So as a VP, Charlie had a choice to make because he realized that unreliable processes were causing high unit costs and they were losing market share and really needed to do something differently. So he turned to the maintenance folks first and said, we need to improve reliability. And he said, I'm going to give you guys a year to improve reliability. A year later, the maintenance guys came back and and the impact of their efforts were a 2% reduction in the unit cost of production. 2%. Probably less than the cost of inflation at the time. So he then turned to the operations folks and said, okay, guys, your shot. What can you do to improve reliability within the plant? Who do you suppose was more effective? Well, that's a loaded question. Operations came back with a 15% reduction in the unit cost of production and actually helped turn that plant around in Tennessee and had a significant and lasting impact. And it was a real learning exercise for Charlie Bailey. And that's why this quote, many, many years later, still stands true. And that is that maintenance can't drive reliability. It has to be led by operations and supported from the top. Senior leadership has to be visible and present and aware of what the needs are. Okay. All three or four of the slides that we've looked at so far have really kind of hinted that a lot of different departments are involved in not just writing up and signing partnerships, but also sharing in responsibility for reliability. And what we're really getting at here is a maintenance interdependency. And I use the term, there are actually 21, I know it's an eye chart and I'm not intending for you to read each of these, but there are 21 different elements listed that are key to successful maintenance management in any facility. The first thing you notice is most of these maintenance has 50% or less impact on the outcome. 30% on this group of 4. There's a group of about 14 here that they have about a 50% impact on the outcome. And only these last 5, does maintenance have a direct impact on being able to at least guarantee an 80% or 80+% success factor. Supervisor and practices, obviously they have charge of the work order system and maintenance planning, measuring, maintenance metrics and equipment history, which planners are responsible for maintaining. So the key here is a lot of functions exist within a plant that directly impact maintenance, yet maintenance does not have full control over the outcome of all these different elements. Quote here that I like, I think is appropriate: maintenance excellence is a team effort, but you can't have an aisle of excellence in a sea of indifference, which means all those people that have this impact on the outcomes can't be indifferent to the real needs of maintenance. And we'll talk more about needs of maintenance in the future. Okay. So interdependency. I keep using this word. You got to go back to Webster. What is interdependency? Webster defines it as a mutually dependent or dependent upon each other condition. Remember the 6 bucket slide that we showed earlier, where unintended defects got into processes at any one of those stages? Well, the obvious answer to all 4 of these questions is no. None of those. Operations can't succeed without maintenance. Maintenance can't succeed without engineering, et cetera, et cetera. They're all partners in the enterprise. And the key word here is enterprise. And the question I would ask you on this slide is, what business are we in to do? In other words, what is our organizational mission statement? Organizational mission statement. Okay, I think it's time for a question. We had a show of hands earlier of how many people were in plant partnerships. What I'd like to get some feedback now is how many of you are satisfied with the partnership that you're currently in? And you can answer by clicking the yes or no box on the right-hand side of your screen. I think you can answer by clicking yes or no. So we're going to give the respondents just a minute or two to give that some serious thought. I actually thought about asking this question the other way, and that is, how many of you are not satisfied with the partnership that you're currently in, which would probably be an easier question to answer, since in my experience, and I'll give some examples earlier. Okay, interesting results. I don't know if you guys can see what I can see, but 91% of the people are not satisfied with their partnership, which figures I've been operating on lately has been about 80%, but we've got a we've got a stellar group on the webinar today, so you guys give yourself some extra credit. Yeah, that trend is kind of common throughout. And there are a lot of reasons for this. And we're going to touch on some of those reasons in just a little bit, but thanks for the response. That's the sort of thing we want to hear. Okay, so roles and responsibilities. Who does what in terms of trying to not just draft up a valid plant partnership, but one that both sides can agree upon and abide by? If you consider any sports team, that's a good analogy. Here's a layout of a football field. One thing is obvious in the game of football, as is any sport, taking the case of football. Everybody can't be the quarterback. You got to have people in line blocking. You got to have people in the backfield that can carry the ball, and you have to have people that can run down the field and catch the ball. Bottom line here is everybody's role, as different as it is from the others, is key to the success of a successful sports team. The plants that we operate in, the businesses that we run, are very much the same. What's different in our case is, if you look at the phrase, there are all functions that have an impact on reliability, and that's bolded for a reason, must understand the role each other plays. That word reliability, you could substitute any number of different words and have the same effect and the same meaning and outcomes within the business. For instance, all functions that have an impact on safety. A reliable plant is a more safe plant. That has been documented time and again. All functions that have an impact on survivability. We're going through some tough times right now. As I mentioned earlier, the scenario with Eastman Chemical. All functions that have an impact on profitability must understand the role each other plays. That gets the bean counters and the people in the front office not just looking at the bottom line, but looking at the sources of defects or the sources of unreliable or off-quality product, losses that we talked about earlier. All functions that have an impact on maintainability. If we're designing great equipment and installing it, but we have poor startup and operate standard operating procedures, or we just don't have the ability to maintain it, we're installing equipment that is very difficult for maintenance and maintainers to install, that the operators and the designers need to understand the impact it has on maintenance. Last but not least, all functions that have an impact on environmental responsibility must understand the role each other plays. One of the biggest dangers many industrial plants face today are newer MAC2, Maximum Achievable Control Technology standards that are reportable and accountable to OSHA or statewide environmental protection agencies. So it's vitally important, particularly in talking about things like calibration of sensitive gauges and meters and devices so that you don't exceed your allowable limits. So functions that have an impact on environmental responsibility have to understand the importance of reliable and maintainable sensors within a plant. Okay, written. Why are these definitions, why we talked about, defining, we'll show some examples of defining not just what the essential elements are of a partnership agreement, but also KPIs, key performance indicators, and metrics. The obvious statement here, which you'll see on top, has to do with clarity around roles can be accomplished by providing written definitions of each function's needs, and that's italicized for a reason, from the other, and holding discussions to ensure agreement. I chose the word needs carefully because these are actual needs, not wants. We don't want wants, what people want in an agreement, because that kind of smacks of that sub-optimization I referred to earlier, when you're really looking out for your own department, not the good of the business. So written, it's simple. What gets written generally gets done. Years ago, there was a phrase in the plant I was working in called "hey boy maintenance," and some of you on this call that may have worked in that plant may remember that term. But I was out in the plant one day talking with a production superintendent, and the superintendent said, I'm pretty satisfied with the way the equipment runs, and the processes seem to be fairly stable and reliable. But he said, I got a problem with your guys in maintenance. And I said, well, what is that? He said, well, they don't do what I tell them to. And I'm thinking to myself, what's wrong with this picture? He just said the equipment runs fine, the processes are within spec, this is a stable environment, plant's making money. Yet the superintendent was not happy because maintenance didn't do what he wanted them to do, as opposed to what the planners and schedulers had scheduled and agreed for them to do. Hey boy, maintenance. There's no place for that in a written partnership. Again, it has to be what are the needs, the essential needs of the departments involved to make certain that you avoid the three deadly C's that come out of wants, and that's chaos, confusion, and confrontation. We don't want those, which typically are associated with wants, not needs. Okay, the other thing is, obviously, and many of you have heard this before, we need to be able to measure our not just our performance on a periodic basis to see that we're complying with targets and minimum standards, and I'll show you some of those in the attachment to the agreement I'm going to show you. But there need to be routine status reviews, not just of the KPIs, the metrics, but also the agreements themselves. And there are some key elements that fit into this measuring how we're doing with agreements. And certainly at a minimum, the agreements ought to be measured, ought to be reviewed annually whenever there's change in a key player. You know, if you get a new plant manager, a new department superintendent, then certainly that's an opportunity to review an agreement. If there's a change in the plant capacity, you know, if the plant gets curtailed for whatever reason, or there's a major expansion, then that's another reason to review the plant partnerships agreements, because it may impact the metrics and what you're actually measuring. So if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And typically, when we talk about metrics, 3 to 5 is the maximum number. The more, and this is a case where more is not better. And I worked in a plant that actually tracked 270 different metrics. All of them weren't maintenance, obviously. They crossed the 6 different departments we saw in the pie chart earlier. That's a little much. Partnership agreements ought to be 3 to 5. Keep them simple. Make them easier for people to understand. It's what I call, get naked with the data. People need to understand what the data is saying. Make it transparent. Or as a plant manager of mine years and years ago said, the plant database needs to be like a fishbowl. People need to be able to look into it and see the data that they want to get access to and use that to their benefit and betterment of the plant, not just their own departmental needs. So, any partnership is not a partnership unless it's equal. Remember the definition of interdependency where I talked about mutual dependence? You know, if operations truly owns reliability, as Charlie Bailey says they should, then partnership agreements are really among equals. It doesn't matter whether it's maintenance or procurement or environmental or safety, a lot of different departments. But the key here is you want to emphasize the importance of equal partnerships, not one partner being subservient to another. Okay, so whiteboard exercise. Why do you think partnerships work? We're gonna let that one run. If there's one or two questions that pop up right away, then I'm happy to share those with the group or ask that person to comment. But in essence of time, we've got about 7 or 8 more minutes. Okay, here's one. Because why do partnerships work? Because both sides commit to it. Equal partnership. Key comment. Okay, here's another comment. If reliability must be driven by the operating units, maintenance must be part of operations. No argument there. In many cases, it isn't. That's kind of indicative of an absence, Carlos, of a working weekly planning and scheduling and coordination meeting, which, and I'll take this as an opportunity to just comment on best practices. Written partnership agreements are obviously an example of best practice. You'll see some of the elements I talked to in a second, which are best practices. But if maintenance isn't viewed as an equal partner, then I would submit that a partnership agreement will not survive unless someone high enough in the organization says, we need partnerships, they need to be written, and we're going to make this work. Remember what Charlie Bailey said when he said it must be led from the top and supported at all levels within the organization, which means, as Scott Franklin has said on many occasions in the Reliability for Excellence Session 2 on change management, you got to have visible and active sponsorship when you're talking about partnerships, because what you're trying to do with these partnerships, quite frankly, is change the culture of how a plant operates. That doesn't happen overnight. It's not automatic. People typically don't like it. Therefore, you got to have high enough sponsorship so that people can say this is not optional. It's a condition of employment. Okay, good feedback. Appreciate that. We're going to continue to look at the chat. Looks good. Okay, let's move on. So here's an opening paragraph from a plant partnership. It's probably an eye chart. I'm not going to read it, but suffice it to say there are three key phrases in this opening paragraph, and I'm just going to touch on them briefly. One is in the first line where we talk about baselines of strong team-based working relationship. Remember the analogy with the football diagram we saw earlier. Everybody has a different role to play, but everybody has the same goal in mind, and that is to win the game or operate profitably. In this particular case, maintenance and operations are mentioned. You can substitute any two departments you want there. Second key phrase is standards that measure the performance of both parties. Down here in the third line, measures the performance of both parties. It's not one just looking at the other. It's both looking at each other. And the third thing, maintenance is not a provider of service, but that of plant capacity. Let me say that again. Maintenance is not a provider of service. Yeah, there's a service component, but the main thing reliable plants have is the ability to uncover that hidden capacity, that hidden plant that everybody has on the nameplate, but they're never able to accomplish. It's the difference between just measuring OEE and looking at asset utilization. What is the 24/7 capability of your site? Those are the sorts of things that need to be discussed in writing written partnership agreements. Okay, here's a sample eye chart. The takeaway is really just four things. There are what I call four key elements to a partnership agreement. They're quantity, delivery, quality, and communication. What we're talking about here in quantity is what does each party do for each other or together? Delivery, what and how are activities delivered? Third thing is quality. What are agreed upon standards to ensure quality of effort? And last but not least, as we saw in the first response, the partnerships work because people are committed to it, is communications. What activities are spelled out in routine meetings? We're not talking about setting up special criteria just to have partnership agreements. Last but not least, the most important part of these partnerships is the last page, and it quite simply says, I agree to this. And what we're talking about is that, in this case, the operations and the maintenance managers sign it and date it. Bottom line, what gets written gets reviewed. What gets signed gets done. People will hold themselves accountable for things that they put their signature on and date. Without that, you will not have a successful partnership. Okay, so I'd talk just a little bit about metrics, KPIs. The embedded in the attachments really should be what I refer to as a partnership satisfaction index. In other words, what are the requirements that, in this case, production has of maintenance? And you could substitute any two departments there, but it's basically spun out the requirement as a specific item. And for instance, on this first one, you see equipment availability is listed. In the description comment would be a list of equipment listed by criticality, and minimum targets, in this case for availability, minimum level and a maximum target. And the response plan is a key element of any partnership agreement, because what this does is the response plan has built into it how people are going to respond if you're below the minimum. If you're not meeting the target and you're below the minimum, then what actions have to be taken by whom? In these cases, we talk about root cause analysis. And it's really cross-functional teams at the floor level typically that are involved in root cause problem solving. So this particular case spells out production requirements of maintenance. A similar index for maintenance requirements for production could be, for instance, maintenance requires that production operate complete 100% of their pre-flights, or maintenance ensures that operations submits work requests in a timely manner, and that maintenance therefore is held accountable for completing that work within a predefined time. But the key is 3 to 5, keep them short, and they're your metrics, your KPIs. They're not something that come from corporate. There may be guidelines from corporate, but the hard work gets done at the departmental level, and this is what people agree to, what they hold each other accountable for. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to one of the other folks in the room here, and we'll talk a little bit about upcoming events, but I want to thank you for your attention today. I didn't see anybody suffering from postprandial somnolence, so I appreciate you hanging in there.
Thanks so much, Hugh. That concludes our webinar this month. If there are any questions in the queue, we'll be sure to get those out to you. We encourage you to register for next month's webinar, Lean Shutdown, How to Cut Fat and Do the Right Thing by Joel Levitt. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.